The air inside the grand ballroom was thick with money and anticipation. It was the kind of night where everything shimmered, from the crystal chandeliers hanging like frozen galaxies from the ceiling, to the diamonds dripping from the necks of the women who floated across the marble floor. The annual Sterling Foundation Gala was more than just a party. It was a statement, a gathering of the city's most powerful people, all there to see and be seen. And tonight, they were all there for one person. Her name was Ilara Vance, and she was not just a pianist. She was a magician of the keys, a woman who could coax sounds from the ivory that made people feel things they had forgotten they could feel. She was the main star, the bright, burning sun around which all these lesser planets revolved. She moved through the crowd with a practiced grace, a smile permanently fixed on her face. It was a beautiful smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. Her eyes were sharp, always watching, calculating. She had worked too hard and sacrificed too much to let this moment be anything less than perfect. People parted for her like the sea, their faces a mixture of awe and desire. They wanted a piece of her brilliance, to be able to say they were in the same room as the great Ilara Vance. A man in a tailored tuxedo bowed low, whispering compliments about her latest album, which had gone triple platinum. She nodded graciously, her mind already on the performance, on the 9-foot concert grand piano that sat on the stage like a silent, waiting beast. It was her throne, and tonight she would reclaim it. The host of the gala, a portly man with a booming voice and an even bigger personality, stepped onto the stage. He tapped the microphone, and the room fell silent. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing through the opulent hall, "we are gathered tonight to celebrate art, to celebrate genius, and to celebrate a woman who embodies both of those words. Please give the warmest of welcomes to the one, the only, Ilara Vance." The room erupted in applause. It was a wave of sound, powerful and adoring. Ilara lifted her chin, a genuine flicker of pride in her eyes. This was what she lived for. This was the validation that made all the lonely hours, all the brutal practice, all the sacrifices worth it. She began her walk toward the stage, her silk gown whispering against the floor. But as she moved, she noticed a strange shift in the atmosphere. It was subtle at first, like a change in the wind. A few people were not looking at her. They were looking down at their phones, their faces illuminated by the blue-white light. A murmur started, low at first, then growing louder, like a distant train getting closer. A woman near the front gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Her husband snatched the phone from her, his eyes widening as he read the screen. Then he looked up, and his gaze was no longer adoring. It was accusatory. Ilara's heart gave a strange, painful lurch. She kept walking, her smile now feeling like a mask made of porcelain about to crack. She saw a man turn his phone so his friend could see. The friend's face went pale. He looked from the phone to Ilara, a look of sheer disbelief on his face. The whispers were now turning into hushed, urgent conversations. People were pointing, not with admiration, but with shock. The wave of applause had died, replaced by a buzzing, hostile energy. She felt a bead of sweat trickle down her spine. What was happening? A public relations nightmare? A bad review? She had faced those before. But this felt different. This felt final. She reached the side of the stage, just out of the main spotlight. A young man with a headset, one of the event organizers, rushed up to her. His face was ashen. "Miss Vance," he whispered, his voice trembling. "You need to see this." He shoved a phone into her hands. On the screen was an article from a major music blog. The headline screamed at her in bold black letters, "Vance's virtuosity a fraud? Expert exposes plagiarism of century." Below it was a side-by-side comparison of her most famous piece, the one that had made her a global superstar, and an obscure, forgotten composition from a little-known composer who had died decades ago. The notes were identical. The structure was the same. It was undeniable. Her blood ran cold. A wave of nausea washed over her. She remembered that piece, finding it in an old, dusty book of sheet music in a second-hand shop in Paris years ago. She had told herself it was a lost gem, a diamond in the rough that she had polished and presented to the world. She had convinced herself of her own lie so completely that she almost believed it. But now, seeing the evidence laid bare, the truth she had buried under a mountain of fame and fortune came roaring back to the surface. She looked up from the phone and out at the crowd. The adoration was gone. In its place was a sea of cold, judging eyes. They were no longer her fans. They were a jury, and they had already found her guilty. The cameras that had been flashing with adoration were now flashing with a new, predatory hunger, capturing her moment of public humiliation. The world was watching her fall, and they were enjoying it. The host was looking at her from the stage, his face a mask of panic. He was mouthing something at her, but she couldn't hear him over the roaring in her ears. She felt trapped, a beautiful butterfly pinned to a board, her wings about to be torn off. The gilded cage she had so carefully built around herself was not just a cage. It was a tomb, and the walls were closing in. She took a shaky breath, her legs feeling like they were made of lead. She had a choice. She could turn and run, escape the ballroom, and try to escape the shame that was about to be poured upon her. Or she could walk out onto that stage, face the wolves, and play. Her pride, that fierce, burning pride that had driven her entire life, made the decision for her. She would not be a coward. She would not let them see her break. She handed the phone back to the organizer, her face a blank, unreadable mask. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and walked into the blinding spotlight. The room fell silent again, but this time it was not a silence of anticipation. It was a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with judgment. She sat on the polished bench, the smooth, cool wood of the piano a small comfort against her trembling hands. She placed her fingers on the keys, the familiar ivory feeling foreign and cold. Out in the darkness, she could see the faint glow of 100 phone screens, all pointed at her, all recording. They were waiting for her to fail. They were waiting for her to crumble. And as she sat there, alone on the stage under the harsh glare of the lights, she knew they were going to get exactly what they wanted. While the world of the rich and glittering was falling apart on the stage, another world was operating just a few feet away, a world of silent service and invisible hands. This was the world of the catering staff, a shadow army moving with practiced efficiency through the edges of the ballroom. They were the ones who cleared the half-empty glasses of champagne, whose bubbles had gone flat. They were the ones who swept up the fallen crumbs from canapes that cost more than they made in a day. They were part of the scenery, as unremarkable as the potted plants or the velvet ropes. Among them was a young woman, her face a mask of polite neutrality as she carried a heavy silver tray. Her simple, black uniform was a stark contrast to the explosion of color and silk around her. She moved with a quiet grace, her eyes downcast, but she saw everything. She saw the way a woman would laugh at a man's joke while her eyes scanned the room for someone more important. She saw the subtle power plays, the quick hidden glances, the secrets whispered behind gloved hands. She was an invisible ghost in a machine of manufactured perfection. But this ghost had a past, a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the clinking of silverware and the low hum of privileged conversation. Just a few years ago, she had been on the other side of the equation. She had been the one people came to see. Her hands, now accustomed to the cold weight of a serving tray, had once been destined for greatness. They had once danced across 88 ivory keys, coaxing out melodies that could make a room full of strangers weep. She could still feel the ghost of the keys under her fingertips, the muscle memory of a lifetime of practice. She remembered the old, slightly out-of-tune piano in her family's small living room, its wood worn smooth in places where her small hands had rested. She remembered her father, a man who worked with his hands, saving every extra penny for her lessons. He never understood the music, but he understood her passion. He would sit in the corner of the room, listening with his eyes closed, a proud, gentle smile on his face. Her dream had been so clear then, so bright. She had won a scholarship to a prestigious conservatory in the city, the same city where she now served canapes. She had walked through its grand halls, her heart thumping with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She had breathed in the smell of old sheet music and rosin and felt like she was finally home. For 2 years, she lived and breathed music. She practiced until her fingers were sore, until her mind was fuzzy with notes and rhythms. She was good, truly good. Her professors told her she had a gift, a rare ability to not just play the notes but to tell a story with them. But stories, she was learning, could be cruel. Her father's small business, a little repair shop he had run for 30 years, began to fail. A bigger chain store opened nearby and his customers slowly disappeared. Then her mother got sick. The medical bills piled up, a mountain of paper that grew higher every month. The scholarship covered her tuition, but it couldn't pay for her family's rent, for her mother's medicine. One evening she came home to find her parents sitting at the kitchen table, the lights dimmed to save electricity. They didn't have to say a word. She saw the exhaustion in her father's eyes, the pale fragility of her mother's face. In that moment her dream didn't just fade. It shattered. The next day she withdrew from the conservatory. It felt like tearing off a limb. She packed her sheet music away in a box under her bed and sold the beautiful used, upright piano she had bought with her own savings. The money paid for 3 months of her mother's treatment. She took the first job she could find, serving at events like this one. She told herself it was temporary, just until things got better. But they never did. And so the musician died and the maid was born. Now, as she moved through the crowd, her eyes fell on the woman at the center of everyone's attention. The star pianist. The young woman felt a familiar, bitter pang in her chest. This was the life she was supposed to have. This woman, with her flawless skin and her diamond necklace, was living the dream that had been stolen from her. She watched the star's performance, her critical ear hearing every note. The technique was perfect, flawless, but to her it sounded empty. It was like a beautiful, gleaming machine with no soul inside. There was no pain, no struggle, no story in the music. It was just sound. And as she watched, she saw the atmosphere in the room begin to shift. She was closer to the ground, closer to the quiet whispers, and she heard the change first. A guest near her muttered something to his wife, his face lit by his phone screen. "No way," he whispered. "It says she stole it." The young woman's heart skipped a beat. She saw the news spread like a virus through the crowd, passed from one glowing screen to another. The adulation on people's faces curdled into something else. Shock. Then disappointment, then a kind of greedy, morbid curiosity. She watched as the star walked toward the stage, a beautiful, trapped animal heading for a slaughter. From her position by a pillar, she had a clear view. She saw the slight tremble in the star's hands as she sat at the piano. She saw the deep, shaky breath she took before she began to play. And then the music started. It was the same piece she was famous for, the one the young woman had heard on the radio a dozen times. But tonight it was different. It was hesitant, filled with small, almost imperceptible mistakes. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded fine, but to her, it was a symphony of terror. She heard a note that was slightly off, a moment of hesitation where there should have been confidence. She was watching a public breakdown set to music. She felt a strange mix of emotions. There was a flicker of pity for the woman on the stage, a fellow musician crumbling under pressure. But there was also something darker, a grim sense of satisfaction. The perfect idol was not so perfect after all. The dream was not as shiny as it seemed. Then it happened. The star's fingers stumbled completely, hitting a series of discordant notes that screamed through the silent hall. It was the sound of a heart breaking. The woman on the stage froze for a second, her face a mask of horror before she fled into the wings, disappearing from sight. A shocked silence fell over the room. And then a voice cut through it, loud and slurred with alcohol. Well, that was a disaster. A man in a ridiculously expensive tuxedo boomed, laughing. His eyes scanned the room, looking for someone to share his cruel joke with. They landed on the young woman standing by the pillar. He had seen her wince when the music went wrong. He had seen the look on her face, a look that understood the failure on a deeper level than anyone else in the room. "Look," he said, pointing a fat finger directly at her. A few heads turned in his direction. Even the maid knows it was terrible. Hey, sweetie, think you could do better? A ripple of cruel laughter spread through the people nearby. More heads turned. More fingers. Suddenly, all eyes were on her. Not on the fallen star, but on the help. The quiet, invisible girl was now the center of attention. A hot, sharp wave of shame washed over her. She felt her face flush crimson. She wanted the floor to open up and swallow her whole. She clutched her tray, the silver suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, and tried to make herself small, to disappear back into the shadows. But it was too late. They had seen her. They had pointed at her. And in that moment of public humiliation, standing alone in her simple black uniform, she felt more exposed and naked than the star who had just fled the stage. The silence that fell over the ballroom was a heavy, suffocating thing. It was worse than noise. It was a vacuum where all the air, all the joy, and all the anticipation had been sucked out, leaving only a thick, awkward tension. The man who had pointed and laughed at the young woman looked around, expecting others to join in his cruel joke, but he found only stony faces and turned backs. The party was over, the magic was broken, and in the middle of it all, the host of the gala, a powerful man who was used to controlling every detail of his world, was watching his reputation crumble in real time. His face, usually a picture of confident charm, was now a thundercloud of barely contained fury. He paced behind a curtain at the side of the stage, his hands clenched into fists. This was supposed to be his night, a celebration of his wealth and his taste. Now it was a public spectacle of failure. His star performer had had a meltdown, and his guests, a pack of wolves in designer clothing, were starting to sniff blood. He had to do something, anything. He couldn't let the evening end like this. He scanned the room, his eyes darting from face to face, looking for a solution, a distraction, a miracle. He saw the shocked socialites, the bored-looking tech billionaires, the aging politicians. None of them could help. They were just the audience. Then his eyes landed on the young woman in the maid's uniform, the one who had just been publicly humiliated. She was trying to melt back into the shadows, her face still burning with shame. But the host wasn't looking at her shame. He was looking at her hands. He remembered seeing her earlier that day while the final preparations were being made. The grand piano on stage had been polished, and he had watched as this young woman, after wiping down the gleaming surface, had let her fingers rest on the keys for just a moment. It was a fleeting thing, a gesture so small most people wouldn't have noticed, but he had. He saw the way her fingers had curved, the familiar, comfortable way they settled into position. And he had heard her, just for a second, hum a few bars of a melody that was complex and beautiful. It was a long shot, it was a desperate, insane gamble, but it was the only shot he had. He moved from behind the curtain, his face now a mask of calm determination. He walked through the crowd, and the guests parted for him, sensing his urgency. He ignored the whispers and the questioning looks. He had one target. He reached the young woman just as she was about to slip through a service door. He blocked her path, his large frame casting a shadow over her. She flinched, looking up at him with wide, frightened eyes like a cornered deer. "You," he said. His voice was low and sharp, not a question but a statement. "You play, don't you?" The young woman shook her head, her mind racing. "No, sir. I don't know what you mean. I'm just here to clear the glasses." Her voice was a small, shaky whisper. She wanted to run. This man's power was a physical force, pressing down on her. "Don't lie to me," he said, his tone softening but becoming no less intense. "I saw you this afternoon. At the piano. Your hands know their way around those keys." Her heart hammered against her ribs. He had seen her. That private moment, that small connection to her lost life, had been witnessed. She felt a fresh wave of humiliation wash over her. "It was nothing," she stammered. It's a habit." The host leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Listen to me. My star has just ruined my evening. My guests are about to leave, and they will take with them a story about how the Sterling Gala was a disaster. I cannot let that happen. You are going to go out there and you are going to play." The young woman stared at him, her mouth agape. "I can't," she breathed. "I haven't played properly in years. I'm not a performer." "You are tonight," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He saw the terror in her eyes, the absolute refusal. He knew he needed more than just commands. He needed leverage. He pulled a checkbook from his inner jacket pocket and the expensive pen. "I will write you a check for $10,000. Right here, right now, just for playing one song." The number hung in the air between them. $10,000. It was more than she could make in a year of serving these people. It was enough to pay for months of her mother's care. It was enough to fix the roof on her parents' house. It was a lifeline thrown into the stormy ocean of her life. But the thought of walking out there, onto that stage, in this uniform, in front of all these people who had just laughed at her, it was a different kind of terror. The terror of failing in front of the world. I can't," she repeated, but her voice was weaker now, filled with doubt. $50,000, the host said, his pen poised over the checkbook. He was looking at her with an unnerving intensity, as if he could see directly into her soul, see the war that was raging inside her. He was betting on her desperation, and he was winning. The young woman's mind was a whirlwind. She saw her father's tired face. She heard the doctor's calm, serious voice explaining the costs of the next round of treatment. She felt the weight of her family's future on her shoulders. And then beneath all that fear and responsibility, she felt something else, a tiny, flickering spark. It was the ghost of the girl she used to be, the girl who lived for music. That girl was whispering to her, telling her to take the chance. Just one more time. She looked from the host's face to the stage. The piano sat there, silent and waiting. It was a monster that had just devoured one career. But to her, it had always been a friend. It was the one place where she had ever truly felt at home. She took a deep, shaky breath, the air catching in her throat. The host saw the change in her eyes. He quickly scribbled on the checkbook, tore out the check, and folded it into her hand. His touch was firm, final. "Go," he said. "Save my party. And save yourself." She didn't look at the check. She just clutched it in her hand, the paper feeling like a lead weight and a feather at the same time. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The host stepped back, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. His desperate gamble had been accepted. As she turned and began the long walk toward the stage, a new wave of whispers swept through the room. People pointed, their expressions a mixture of shock, confusion, and morbid curiosity. The maid was walking toward the piano. The uniformed girl who had just been the butt of a cruel joke was now the center of attention. Every step felt like a mile. The cheap fabric of her uniform felt rough against her skin. The lights from the chandeliers seemed to blind her. She could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on her, judging her, wondering what on earth was happening. She kept her gaze fixed on the piano, focusing on the one thing in the room that made sense. She reached the stage and climbed the 3 small steps, her legs trembling so badly she was afraid they would give out. She walked across the polished wood and stood before the instrument. It was bigger than she remembered, a majestic beast of black wood and gleaming ivory. She reached out and gently touched the smooth, cool surface of a key. A jolt like an electric current shot up her arm. It felt familiar. It felt like coming home. She slowly lowered herself onto the bench, the simple, straight-backed chair feeling like a throne. The room was utterly silent. She could hear her own heartbeat, a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She placed her hands on the keys, her fingers finding their natural positions as if no time had passed at all. The world outside the music faded away. The whispers, the pointing, the humiliation, the desperate host, it all disappeared. There was only her and the piano and the silence. And in that silence, she took one last deep breath and prepared to speak the only language she had ever truly known. For a moment, the only sound in the grand ballroom was the soft rustle of the young woman's simple uniform as she settled onto the piano bench. It was a sound completely out of place, a whisper of reality in a world of fantasy. Out in the crowd, The atmosphere was a toxic mix of confusion and contempt. People leaned toward each other, whispering behind their hands. A few didn't even bother to hide their smirks. The man who had publicly mocked her earlier was now grinning broadly, as if his cruel joke had unexpectedly spawned a sequel. This was better than theater. This was a train wreck in slow motion, and they all had front row seats. They saw the cheap black shoes, the simple dress, the nervous way she held her shoulders. They saw a maid, not a musician. They expected a clumsy, perhaps even comical, performance. They were preparing to be amused. The young woman felt their collective gaze like a physical weight, 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her skin. Her heart was a wild bird beating against the bars of her ribs. She looked down at her hands, resting on the ivory keys. They looked so small, so out of place. She thought of the check folded in her pocket, a paper talisman against her family's ruin. She thought of her father's tired eyes, her mother's frail hands. And then she thought of the music. She closed her eyes for a brief second, shutting out the faces, the judgment, the glittering, hostile room. She took a breath, and when she opened her eyes again, they were focused only on the keys. Her fingers, trembling slightly, began to move. The first notes that emerged were not what anyone expected. They were not loud or showy. They were quiet, almost hesitant, like a question asked in a dark room. A single clear melody line, simple and pure, hung in the air. It was a sound that seemed to come from a great distance, from a long time ago. A few people in the crowd chuckled softly, a dismissive sound. But the chuckles died quickly. Because there was something in that simple melody that didn't belong on a stage like this. It was too honest. It was too real. It wasn't a performance. It was a confession. As the first few bars unfolded, a strange thing began to happen. The whispers started to fade. Not all at once, but one by one, like candles being snuffed out in a sudden breeze. A woman who had been whispering to her husband about the scandal stopped mid-sentence, her head tilted, a frown of concentration on her face. The melody began to grow, to gain confidence. It was as if the young woman was remembering who she was, her fingers finding their old strength and grace. The music started to tell a story. It wasn't a story of grand palaces or passionate love affairs, the kind of stories usually told in this hall. It was a simpler story. It was the sound of a small, crowded living room. It was the sound of rain on a window pane. It was the feeling of hope mixed with a deep, nagging worry. The notes weren't technically perfect, not like the previous star's flawless, machine-like playing. Here and there, a note was held just a fraction too long, or a chord was struck with a little more force than necessary. But these imperfections were not mistakes. They were the fingerprints of emotion. They were the sound of a human heart with all its beautiful, messy flaws. The cruel man in the expensive tuxedo was no longer smiling. His grin had faded, replaced by a look of bewildered confusion. He had come to mock a maid, but instead he was being forced to listen to a part of himself he had long ago buried. The music was speaking a language everyone understood, even if they couldn't name the notes. It spoke of disappointment, of dreams that had shriveled and died. It spoke of the quiet dignity of getting up every morning and facing a world that didn't see you. It was the soundtrack to every secret struggle in that room. People who had been checking their phones slowly lowered them to their laps. The glowing screens went dark. The wait staff, who had been moving with practiced invisibility, froze in place, their trays held loosely in their hands. They, more than anyone, understood the music. They lived its story every single day. The young woman on the bench was no longer a maid in a uniform. She had become a vessel, and her pain, her strength, and her forgotten dreams were pouring out into the room. The music swelled, growing in complexity and power. It was no longer just a sad, quiet melody. It was a storm of feeling. There was anger in it now, a fierce, raging anger at the unfairness of the world. There was a deep, bone-weary sorrow. But running through it all, like a thread of gold in a dark tapestry, there was something else. There was resilience. There was hope. It was the sound of a person who had been knocked down again and again, but had always found the strength to get back up. The entire ballroom was now captured in a net of silence. It was a profound, heavy silence, the complete opposite of the stunned silence that had followed the previous star's failure. That silence had been empty, awkward. This silence was full. It was vibrating with the emotion of the music. It was a shared, sacred space. A famous music critic, a man known for his scathing reviews and his cynical heart, felt a hot tear trace a path down his wrinkled cheek. He was not a man who cried. He hadn't cried in years, but the music had bypassed his brain, his intellect, his professional judgment, and had spoken directly to his soul. He was not a critic anymore. He was just a man listening to another human being's truth. The young woman was lost in the music, her body swaying slightly. Her eyes were closed, her face a mask of intense concentration and raw emotion. She was not playing for the host, or for the money, or for the crowd. She was playing for the father who had believed in her, for the mother who needed her, and for the girl she used to be, the girl with the big dream. She was giving that girl a voice, one last time. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the storm of music began to subside. The complex, angry chords softened, the powerful melody quieted down, and it returned to the simple, pure notes it had started with. It was like the sun breaking through after a long, hard rain. The final note hung in the air, shimmering and delicate, before it slowly, gently faded into nothing. And then there was silence. Not a single cough, not a rustle of a program, not a clink of a glass. It was a perfect, absolute, breathtaking silence. The young woman kept her hands on the keys, her head bowed, her chest rising and falling with each deep breath. She was as still as a statue, as if she too was afraid to break the spell. The room, moments before a place of judgment and cruelty, was now a sanctuary. And in that sacred silence everyone held their breath, waiting. The silence in the ballroom stretched on, thick and heavy, like a held breath. It was no longer an awkward or a hostile silence. It was a sacred one, a shared moment of profound emotion that no one wanted to be the first to break. The young woman sat at the piano, her head still bowed, her hands resting limply on the keys. She felt completely empty, as if she had poured every single drop of herself, her pain, her memories, her forgotten hopes out into the room. She was a vessel that had been drained. The adrenaline that had carried her through the performance was gone, and in its place was a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. She was aware of the hundreds of eyes on her, but for the first time that night, she didn't feel judged. She just felt exposed. She slowly lifted her head, her eyes blinking in the bright stage lights, trying to focus on the shadowy figures in the audience. She expected the whispers to start again, the smirks to return. She had done her part, earned the host's money. Now the spell would break, and she would go back to being invisible. But it didn't happen. The silence remained. Then, from the back of the room, a single sound broke the stillness. It was the sharp, clear clap of a pair of hands. It was so unexpected that a few people jumped. The sound came from an old man in a worn but expensive suit, a man whose face was familiar to anyone who read the arts section of the newspaper. He was the famous critic, the man known for his brutal honesty and his withering reviews. He was the last person anyone expected to applaud this strange, unpolished performance. But he was on his feet, his face wet with tears, clapping with a fierce, unwavering rhythm. His solitary applause hung in the air for a moment, a challenge to the room's stunned silence. Then another person stood up and joined in. Then another and another. It started as a slow, hesitant ripple, but it quickly grew into a tidal wave. One by one, then in groups, the entire room rose to its feet. The applause was not polite or reserved. It was thunderous, deafening, a roar of raw emotion that shook the very foundations of the building. People were not just clapping. They were shouting, "Bravo!" Some were crying openly, without shame. The man who had mocked her earlier was standing too, his face a picture of utter shock and awe, his hands clapping so hard they were red. The young woman just stared, her mind unable to process what was happening. This was not for her. This couldn't be for her. She was just a girl who played a song. The host of the gala strode back onto the stage, a broad, triumphant grin on his face. His desperate gamble had paid off beyond his wildest dreams. He had not just saved his party. He had become a part of a legendary moment. He walked over to the young woman and gently took her arm, helping her to her feet. She was unsteady, her legs feeling like jelly. He held up his hands, and the roaring crowd slowly began to quiet down, though many remained standing, their faces still glowing with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen," the host said, his voice booming with pride, "you have just witnessed a miracle. You have just heard the sound of a true artist's soul." The crowd erupted in another wave of applause. The host turned to the young woman. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice softer now, full of genuine respect. She hesitated, then whispered her name into the microphone. It was a simple, ordinary name, but to the people in that room it now sounded like magic. The host then pulled the check from his pocket and held it up for everyone to see. "A deal is a deal," he announced. "But this is not a payment. This is a small thank you for giving us a gift we will never forget." He handed her the check, and she took it with a trembling hand, the paper feeling unreal in her fingers. The rest of the evening was a blur. People came up to her, not with pity or curiosity, but with reverence. They wanted to shake her hand, to tell her how her music had touched them. A woman with diamonds around her neck told her that the song made her think of her own daughter, who had given up on her dreams. A stern-looking businessman confessed that it made him remember why he had started his own company so many years ago. They saw her not as a maid who had a lucky break, but as a fellow human being who had dared to be vulnerable, and in doing so had given them permission to feel something real. Backstage, while she was trying to gather her thoughts and her coat, a man in a well-tailored suit approached her. He was calm and professional, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the ballroom. He introduced himself as a representative from a major record label. "I've been in this business for 30 years, he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I have seen thousands of performers. I have manufactured stars and signed prodigies. But I have never heard anything like what you did out there. We don't want to make you into something you're not. We just want to give you a studio and let you play. Would you be interested in talking about that?" The young woman could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. In the days that followed, her life changed with a speed that was dizzying. The story of the sterling gala Maid became a global sensation. News crews were camped outside her family's small apartment. The video of her performance, filmed on dozens of phones, went viral, viewed by millions of people around the world. It wasn't just the music that captivated them. It was the story. The story of the hidden talent, the dream deferred, the moment of unexpected triumph. It was a modern-day fairy tale, and people couldn't get enough of it. The record label offer was just the beginning. There were interviews, television appearances, and offers for concerts around the world. The money from the host's check, which had seemed like a fortune, was now just a small part of the life she was building. She was able to move her parents to a better home, get her mother the best medical care, and tell her father that he could finally retire. The story of the fallen star pianist, on the other hand, quickly faded from the headlines. Her name became a cautionary tale, a footnote in the story of the Maid's rise. The last anyone heard, she had left the country, disappearing into a quiet life of obscurity. The final scene takes place a few months later. The young woman is walking into a professional recording studio for the very first time. She is not wearing a maid's uniform, but a simple pair of jeans and a soft sweater. Her hair is down and she looks relaxed, peaceful. As she walks through the lobby, she passes a newsstand. On the front of a newspaper is a small headline, "Vance's career in ruins, sources say." The young woman glances at it, but there is no flicker of triumph or even interest in her eyes. She doesn't feel any satisfaction in the other woman's downfall. Her story is no longer about her. She pushes open the heavy studio door and steps inside. In the middle of the room, bathed in a warm, soft light, sits a beautiful grand piano. It is waiting for her. She walks toward it, a quiet, gentle smile spreading across her face. The uniform, the ballroom, the shame, it all felt like a lifetime ago. This was her new reality. This was her home. And as she sat down on the bench, placing her familiar hands on the cool, waiting keys, she knew, with a certainty that filled her entire being, that her voice at long last had been heard.